The late autumn air pressed against the mansion's windows like an unwelcome guest, carrying the damp chill of impending rain. Inside the Rosewood estate, the annual gala blazed with light and noise, chandeliers throwing crystal patterns across marble floors, champagne flowing like rivers of gold, laughter echoing through rooms designed to amplify wealth and intimidate challengers. The atmosphere was dense with competing perfumes, cigar smoke from the terrace, and something else harder to name: the metallic scent of power exchanged in handshakes, the sharp tang of ambition masked as civility. Women wore jewelry that could ransom cities. Men adjusted cufflinks worth more than cars. And through it all moved the staff, shadows in black and white, present when needed, invisible when not. Lisa Brantley had been on her feet for 9 hours. Her lower back screaming protests she'd learned to silence, her calves burning with the particular ache that came from constant motion on unforgiving marble. The crisp maid's uniform she'd pressed that morning now clung to her skin, absorbing tension along with perspiration as she navigated the dangerous choreography of serving the city's most powerful criminals disguised as legitimate businessmen. She moved with the precision of someone who'd spent 5 years perfecting the art of reading a guest's needs before they formed the thought to summon help, refilling glasses seconds before they emptied, clearing plates with the timing of a synchronized swimmer, positioning herself exactly where she needed to be without ever seeming to rush. Her practiced smile had held for the entire evening, though the muscles around her eyes ached from maintaining false warmth in a room where genuine emotion was as rare as honesty. But she couldn't slow down, not tonight. Not when her mother's medical bills sat unpaid on her kitchen counter, accumulating late fees like compound interest. Not when the notice on her apartment door had given her until the end of the month. Not when every dollar in tips represented another week of breathing room before the collection agencies started their relentless calls. The main ballroom hummed with the particular energy of wealth mixed with danger. Business associates who might order each other's deaths on Monday clinked glasses on Saturday. Political figures posed for photographs with men whose charitable foundations laundered money with the efficiency of industrial machinery. Trophy wives laughed at jokes that weren't funny, because the alternative was acknowledging they'd sold themselves to the highest bidder. Lisa slipped through all of it like smoke through a screen door, a champagne tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her movements economical and precise, her expression calibrated to pleasant neutrality. She'd learned the paradox of service work in elite circles: be present enough to anticipate needs, invisible enough to protect their illusions of privacy. Perhaps that's why she'd developed the skill that would save a life tonight. Years of forced invisibility had sharpened her observation to a surgical edge. While the powerful played their games, Lisa cataloged their tells, the micro-expressions that betrayed lies, the body language that revealed alliances, the subtle shifts in posture that preceded violence. She'd learned to read the room the way predators read terrain, not from curiosity but from survival, because understanding the threats around you was the only way to navigate spaces where you were always the most expendable person present. And tonight, that skill locked onto something wrong. Tony Olson occupied the corner table with the territorial confidence of someone who knew he was the apex predator in any room he entered. Lisa had served him at 4 previous events over the past year, always the same routine. Arriving precisely on time, flanked by security, ordering bourbon neat with a specific brand preference, speaking in measured tones that made people lean in to hear him. He wore wealth like comfortable clothes rather than costume, the kind of natural authority that came from decades of command. But what made Tony Olson truly dangerous wasn't his power, it was his absolute faith in James Kinlaw. James stood slightly behind Tony's right shoulder, positioned where a guardian angel might hover if angels wore tailored suits and carried concealed weapons. He'd been Tony's right-hand man for 12 years, the kind of loyalty that transcended employment and became identity. Where Tony went, James followed. When Tony spoke, James listened with the intensity of someone translating scripture. The entire organization understood that crossing James meant crossing Tony, and crossing Tony meant disappearing. Lisa had observed their dynamic during previous events, the unspoken communication, the synchronized movements, the absolute trust that allowed Tony to focus on conversations while James managed threats. It was beautiful in its precision, like watching a dance perfected over years of practice, which is exactly why Lisa noticed when the choreography changed. She was refilling champagne flutes near Tony's table, maintaining her invisible presence while her trained eyes catalogued the room when she saw it. James adjusted his left cuff with his right hand, a movement so subtle most people would dismiss it as fidgeting. But Lisa's instinct, honed by necessity, caught the deliberate precision. The angle was wrong, the timing was calculated, and most damning, James's eyes flicked toward a nondescript man near the terrace entrance, holding the gaze for exactly 3 seconds before returning to neutral. That look carried weight, communication, confirmation. And suddenly, with the horrifying clarity of pieces falling into terrible alignment, Lisa understood. James Kinlaw, the unquestionable pillar of Tony Olson's empire, was about to betray him. Tonight, here. The signal had been given, the pieces were in position, and Tony, powerful, paranoid, prepared for every threat except the one standing at his shoulder, had no idea he was the payment in someone else's transaction. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she finished pouring, her mind racing through implications and impossible choices. If she was wrong, if she intervened, and this was paranoid misreading of innocent gestures, Tony Olson would likely have her killed for the audacity of accusing his most trusted man. If she was right but did nothing, she'd watch a man die and carry the guilt of preventable murder. But if she was right and acted, if she could somehow warn Tony before James struck, she might survive this night and finally escape the shadows that had defined her entire life. The decision formed with the speed of instinct overtaking fear. Lisa set down her empty tray and moved toward the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands reaching for a pen and the small notepad staff used to record orders. She had perhaps 3 minutes before James would give the next signal, before the ambush would begin, before Tony Olson would discover that loyalty, like everything else in his world, could be purchased by the right buyer. She wrote quickly, her handwriting jagged with urgency, the message raw and explicit because subtlety would get him killed. "Your right-hand man sold you out. You are the payment." Then Lisa Brantley, invisible maid and expert observer, did the most visible thing she'd ever done in her life. She walked directly toward the table where a mafia boss sat beside the man about to murder him, carrying a note that would either save them both or get her killed in the next 60 seconds. "Stay with me until the end because this story will shock you to the core." Before we begin, hit subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Now let's get back into the story. The Rosewood estate existed in a category beyond mere wealth. It was power-made architecture, intimidation disguised as elegance. The mansion occupied 5 acres in the city's most exclusive district, surrounded by walls that seemed decorative but were reinforced with security technology that would make government facilities envious. Old Money and New Crime had purchased it jointly 3 decades ago, transforming it into neutral territory where the city's most dangerous players could gather without fear of surveillance or interference. Tonight's annual gala was invitation only, and the invitation list read like a criminal empire's organizational chart with a thin veneer of legitimate business titles. CEOs whose companies existed primarily on paper. Philanthropists whose charitable foundations served as sophisticated money laundering operations. Politicians whose campaigns were funded by donors who expected very specific returns on their investments. The event planning had cost more than most people earned in a year. Ice sculptures melted slowly in the entrance hall, each carved into elaborate designs that would survive perhaps 3 hours before dissolving into expensive water. Floral arrangements imported from 3 countries created walls of color and fragrance throughout the main rooms. A string quartet played in the conservatory, their classical repertoire providing cultured background noise for conversations about territorial disputes and profit margins. The dress code was formal, enforced by security at the entrance who turned away anyone failing to meet standards. Women wore gowns that cost thousands, their jewelry authentic enough to require insurance riders. Men's suits were custom tailored, their watches more valuable than small vehicles. Everyone who mattered was present, and everyone who was present mattered in ways that wouldn't appear in any legitimate directory. But beneath the polished surface, the gala operated according to rules older and more rigid than any legal framework. Territories were respected, disputes were tabled, weapons were checked at a discreet station that everyone pretended not to notice. The evening existed as a temporary ceasefire, a chance for the city's criminal hierarchy to see and be seen, to form alliances and identify threats, to conduct the kind of business that couldn't happen over monitored phone lines or in spaces subject to warrant searches. The staff navigating this dangerous pageantry numbered 30. Bartenders, servers, coat check attendants, valets, all carefully vetted through employment agencies that understood discretion wasn't optional. They'd been briefed on protocols that went far beyond normal hospitality standards. Never repeat anything you overhear. Never make eye contact with guests unless directly addressed. Never ask questions about why someone arrived with security or left through the kitchen exit. Violation of these rules didn't result in termination. It resulted in disappearance. Lisa Brantley had worked 5 of these annual galas, each one teaching her new lessons about survival in spaces where her life meant less than the champagne she served. She'd been hired through an agency specializing in placing domestic workers in high-security environments, her background check more thorough than most government clearances. No criminal record, no social media presence worth mentioning, no connections to law enforcement or journalism. She was perfect for the role because she desperately needed the money and had cultivated the crucial skill of seeming utterly forgettable. She'd learned the geography of invisibility over 5 years of domestic service, how to move through rooms without disrupting conversations, how to anticipate needs before being summoned, how to make eye contact just long enough to acknowledge instructions before looking away. Rich people wanted servants to be functional ghosts, present when required but otherwise non-existent, incapable of judgment or memory. For Black women in service work, that invisibility carried additional weight. Lisa had discovered that wealthy white patrons often looked through her rather than at her, their eyes sliding past her presence as if she were furniture that occasionally moved. It was dehumanizing, exhausting, and absolutely necessary for survival. Being noticed meant being scrutinized, and scrutiny meant risk in environments where powerful people expected absolute discretion. But Lisa had transformed that forced invisibility into something valuable. While guests assumed she couldn't understand their conversations or lacked the intelligence to recognize implications, Lisa had been observing, cataloging, learning. She'd developed an encyclopedia of behavioral patterns, how people moved when lying, the micro-expressions that preceded violence, the subtle power dynamics that determined who actually controlled rooms despite official hierarchies. She'd watched business deals happen in whispered asides near the bar. She'd seen alliances form and fracture over cigar smoke on the terrace. She'd observed the careful choreography of respect and intimidation that governed interactions between rival factions. And she'd learned that in spaces filled with predators, survival meant understanding exactly where danger lived and how to navigate around it. Tonight's gala felt different from the moment Lisa arrived. The security presence was heavier, with additional personnel stationed at exits she'd never seen monitored before. Conversations seemed more guarded, voices dropping to whispers more frequently than usual. Several expected attendees hadn't appeared, their absence noted through the meaningful glances exchanged by those who understood what empty chairs signified. Something was building, Some tension that Lisa's finely tuned instincts recognized without fully understanding. The atmosphere carried the electric charge that preceded storms. The sense that carefully maintained balance was about to shift in ways that would leave casualties. Lisa moved through the dangerous elegance with practiced efficiency, her silver tray balanced perfectly, her expression neutral, her awareness spanning the entire ballroom while appearing focused only on immediate tasks. She was invisible by necessity, observant by survival, and completely unprepared for the moment when those skills would force her into visibility that could either save a life or end her own. Tony Olson commanded attention without requiring it, the kind of natural authority that made rooms reorganize themselves around his presence. He was 54, graying at the temples in a way that added gravitas rather than age, built like someone who'd maintained physical discipline long after needing it for street work. His suit was understated compared to the peacocking displays worn by newer money, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, expensive in ways only experts would recognize. He'd built his empire over 3 decades, starting as muscle for the Castellano family, before systematically acquiring territory, loyalty, and leverage until he'd become the singular power in the city's organized crime hierarchy. Tony didn't rule through explosive violence or theatrical displays. He ruled through calculated strategy, through knowing exactly when to apply pressure and when to offer mercy, through building a reputation for keeping his word absolutely while destroying anyone who betrayed theirs. The other guests at the gala treated Tony with the particular deference reserved for apex predators. When he moved through the ballroom, conversations paused fractionally, allowing him passage without requiring him to navigate around people. When he spoke, those nearby leaned in to catch every word, understanding that Tony Olson's casual observations often carried instructions that would be expected to manifest without further discussion. He didn't make threats or issue ultimatums. He simply stated reality, and reality rearranged itself to accommodate his vision. His table in the corner wasn't the largest or most ornate, but its position was strategic. Back to the wall, clear sightlines to all entrances, close enough to the terrace exit for rapid evacuation if necessary. Tony had survived this long by never assuming safety, by treating every environment as potentially hostile, by maintaining protocols that his organization understood were non-negotiable. But Tony Olson's greatest strength, the foundation that allowed him to operate with confidence that bordered on arrogance, stood slightly behind his right shoulder. James Kinlaw had been at Tony's side for 12 years, ever since Tony had recruited him from a rival organization with the kind of offer that combined financial incentive with strategic opportunity. James was 41, built like a linebacker who'd traded bulk for lethal efficiency, with the controlled movements of someone trained in multiple forms of violence. His suits were slightly less expensive than Tony's, his jewelry more understated, his entire presentation calibrated to say second in command, without ever appearing subordinate. What made James invaluable wasn't his capacity for violence, though that was considerable. What made him irreplaceable was his absolute, unquestioned loyalty. In an industry where betrayal was currency and trust was suicidal, James Kinlaw had never wavered, never hesitated, never shown the slightest indication that any offer could turn him. Tony had tested that loyalty deliberately over the years. He'd exposed James to enormous temptations, rival families offering triple his salary, opportunities to seize territory for himself. Moments when Tony appeared vulnerable and overthrowing him would have been tactically simple. James had reported every approach, refused every offer, and eliminated several would-be conspirators without requiring Tony's explicit instruction. Their relationship had evolved beyond professional partnership into something resembling brotherhood, though neither man would use that sentimental language. They communicated in shorthand, understanding each other's tactical thinking well enough to coordinate responses without extensive discussion. When Tony negotiated, James read the room's threat level. When Tony ate, James monitored approaches. When Tony slept, James maintained security protocols that had kept both of them alive through 2 decades of enemies seeking opportunities. The organization understood that hurting Tony required going through James, and going through James was effectively impossible. He'd survived 3 assassination attempts, neutralized 2 internal coup efforts, and maintained Tony's security with such consistent excellence that the boss had stopped consciously registering the protection, the way you stop noticing the security system that never fails. Tony trusted exactly 3 people in his life: his sister, his lawyer, and James Kinlaw. And of those 3, only James had access to his daily movements, his security protocols, his vulnerability points. That trust was absolute because it had been earned through years of flawless service, because James had saved Tony's life on 4 separate occasions, because betting your survival on someone for over a decade without a single betrayal created a bond that transcended normal organizational hierarchy. Tonight, Tony sat at his corner table with James positioned exactly where he always stood, right shoulder, 2 steps back, hands loosely clasped, eyes constantly scanning the room's dynamics. They'd arrive together, would leave together, and in the intervening hours, James would maintain the vigilance that allowed Tony to conduct business without constantly watching for threats. Other guests noticed the dynamic with mixture of envy and recognition. Everyone in organized crime understood the value of a truly loyal lieutenant. And everyone knew that James Kinlaw represented the gold standard: competent, discreet, and utterly dedicated to Tony Olson's continued existence. Several men at the gala would have paid fortunes to steal James away, to turn that loyalty toward their own organizations. But the offers had stopped coming years ago, after it became clear that James couldn't be bought, threatened, or seduced. He'd chosen Tony, and that choice appeared permanent, unshakable, the one constant in an industry where alliances shifted like sand. Tony adjusted his bourbon glass, a casual gesture that James registered with peripheral awareness. Without being asked, James signaled a passing server to bring a fresh pour, the kind of anticipatory service that came from years of synchronization. Watching them, you'd never suspect that one was about to kill the other. You'd never imagine that 12 years of loyalty was camouflage for the most profitable betrayal of James Kinlaw's career. You'd never believe that Tony Olson, paranoid and prepared for every threat, had positioned his greatest vulnerability exactly where he thought he was safest. Lisa Brantley, invisible in her maid's uniform, refilling champagne glasses with mechanical precision, knew better, because she'd seen the signal. And in that moment, she understood exactly what was about to happen in the next 5 minutes, unless someone broke the cardinal rule of survival and made herself visible to the most dangerous man in the room. If you hate backstabbers like James, hit that subscribe button right now. Only people who support betrayal will ignore this. Lisa had developed her observational skills the way prisoners develop enhanced hearing, out of absolute necessity, in environments where missing crucial information meant suffering consequences. 5 years of navigating spaces where powerful people conducted dangerous business while pretending she didn't exist had trained her to notice patterns, deviations, the subtle tells that preceded violence or betrayal. She'd learned to read micro-expressions before she knew the term. The slight narrowing of eyes that meant someone was lying. The tension in jaw muscles that indicated suppressed rage. The way hands moved toward weapons concealed in shoulder holsters or ankle rigs. The shift in posture that happened when predators identified prey. Most importantly, she'd learned to distinguish between normal behavior and performance. When wealthy people relaxed in their mansions, their movements became natural, unguarded. When they performed for audiences, every gesture carried intention, calculation, the deliberate choreography of people managing their image. Lisa had observed James Kinlaw at 4 previous galas, always from the periphery of his awareness, always while performing her invisible servant routine. She'd cataloged his patterns with the same systematic attention she gave to every potential threat in her environment. James moved with economy, no wasted motion. his awareness spanning 360 degrees without apparent effort. His hands stayed visible or precisely positioned. His stance allowed rapid movement in any direction. Everything about him communicated competence, vigilance, and absolute dedication to Tony Olson's security. But tonight, something was different. Lisa was circulating through the ballroom with a tray of champagne flutes, her path taking her past Tony's corner table, when she caught it. James adjusted his left cuff with his right hand, reaching across his body in a movement that violated his usual economy of motion. The gesture looked natural enough to casual observation, just a man straightening his appearance. But Lisa's trained eye recognized the deliberateness. The angle was wrong for simple adjustment. The timing created a visible moment in what was usually seamless vigilance. And most damning, the movement exposed his watch face at a specific angle, catching light in a way that would be visible across the room. Lisa's gaze followed the implied line of sight almost unconsciously, years of reading rooms leading her eyes to the recipient of that signal. A man stood near the terrace entrance, unremarkable in every calculated way. Mid-40s, forgettable features, suit that was expensive but not memorable, posture that said legitimate businessman rather than enforcer. He held a cocktail loosely, appeared to be watching the string quartet, gave every indication of being exactly what he seemed, except for 3 seconds. For exactly 3 seconds, his eyes locked with James's. No nod, no gesture, just sustained eye contact that carried weight, communication, confirmation. Then both men returned to neutral, the moment passing so quickly that anyone not specifically watching would have missed it entirely. Lisa felt ice slide down her spine, her professional smile freezing slightly as her mind processed what she'd witnessed. That wasn't casual recognition between acquaintances. That was coordination between operators executing a planned sequence. She'd seen enough criminal choreography over 5 years to recognize the difference between spontaneous interaction and rehearsed signal. She continued her circuit, forcing her hands steady, her breathing controlled, while her mind raced through implications. James Kinlaw, Tony Olson's unquestionable right hand, had just communicated covertly with someone positioned at a strategic exit. The movement had been subtle enough to avoid detection by Tony or the obvious security personnel, but precise enough to convey confirmation. Confirmation of what? Lisa's eyes tracked the room with new focus, her server's invisibility allowing her to observe without being observed. She noticed details that suddenly assembled into a horrifying pattern. 3 men positioned at different exits, all sharing the unremarkable quality of the terrace contact, none of them interacting with other guests, all of them maintaining clear sightlines to Tony's table while appearing to focus elsewhere. Another man near the bar, his positioning allowing rapid movement toward Tony's corner. His suit jacket cut slightly loose in a way that could conceal a weapon. His weight distribution suggesting combat training despite his accountant appearance. And James, standing in his usual position behind Tony's shoulder, the perfect guardian angel who was actually a Judas awaiting his 30 pieces of silver and the signal to collect payment. Lisa felt her stomach drop as the full scope of the trap became clear. This wasn't a spontaneous attack, this was coordinated assassination, planned with the kind of sophistication that required inside knowledge of Tony's security protocols, his positioning, his vulnerabilities, and the only person with that comprehensive knowledge was the man Tony trusted absolutely. The ambush had been designed perfectly. Tony sat with his back to a wall, thinking himself secure, unaware that the wall was actually a trap. The corner that protected him from approach also limited his escape routes. The positioning that allowed James to monitor threats actually positioned James to eliminate Tony the moment the signal came. And the signal, Lisa realized with mounting horror, had just been given. The cuff adjustment wasn't communication about future action, it was confirmation of current readiness. The 3-second eye contact was the final checkpoint before execution. Which meant the killing was about to start, maybe in the next 2 minutes. maybe in the next 30 seconds. Maybe the instant Tony lifted his bourbon glass and created the fractional distraction that would let James draw the weapon concealed under his jacket. Lisa's mind presented her with brutal clarity. She was watching a man about to die. A powerful, dangerous man whose death would trigger immediate chaos, probably gunfire, certainly casualties among the staff who were always most expendable when violence erupted. She could walk away, finish her shift, collect her tips, and pretend she hadn't seen what was about to happen. Except she couldn't. Some combination of conscience and survival instinct wouldn't allow it. Because if James was betraying Tony, if this ambush succeeded, the conspirators would need to eliminate witnesses. And Lisa had seen the signal, had tracked the pattern, had observed the setup with the exact kind of detailed awareness that made her dangerous to anyone wanting to claim this, looked like a random attack or internal dispute. She was already a witness, which made her already a target. Unless she did something that seemed suicidal and might be the only thing that could save both their lives. Lisa set her champagne tray on a side table with hands that wanted to shake, but didn't. Her decision forming with the speed that came from recognizing that hesitation was just another way of choosing death. She moved toward the service station where staff supplies were kept, her mind already composing the message that would either rescue Tony Olson from betrayal or get her killed for the audacity of speaking truth to powers. She had perhaps 90 seconds before James made his move, and she had absolutely no idea if Tony Olson would believe a warning from an invisible maid about the man he trusted more than anyone in his organization. Lisa's hands moved automatically through the service station routine, setting down her empty tray, reaching for fresh linens, while her mind operated at a completely different speed, racing through scenarios and consequences with the desperate efficiency of someone calculating survival odds in real time. The truth she'd pieced together was elegant in its brutality. Tony Olson wasn't the target of a rival family's attack. He was the payment in someone else's transaction. James Kinlaw had been bought, probably years ago, his legendary loyalty nothing but deep cover for the most valuable betrayal in the city's criminal history. Whoever owned James now had paid enormous sums for access to Tony's vulnerabilities, his security protocols, his absolute trust. And tonight, at this neutral ground gala, where everyone had checked weapons and lowered their guard, James would deliver the merchandise. The setup was perfect. When Tony died here, surrounded by witnesses, with his own right-hand man holding the weapon, it would look like internal betrayal rather than external attack. The conspiracy would be contained, the investigation compromised from the inside, and James would probably disappear into witness protection or a rival organization's protection with enough money to retire comfortably on his treachery. Lisa felt sick understanding the sophistication of it. This wasn't a crime of passion or a desperate power grab. This was a business transaction, carefully negotiated, precisely executed, and absolutely lethal. And she, invisible Lisa Brantley, maid and observer, had maybe 60 seconds to decide whether to die quietly or die loudly, trying to prevent it. The risks of intervention assembled themselves in her mind with brutal clarity. If she approached Tony and his accusation against James was wrong, if she'd misread the signals, if her paranoid observation had seen conspiracy in innocent gestures, Tony would likely have her killed immediately. Men like him didn't tolerate staff making wild accusations about their most trusted people. The best-case scenario involved being fired and blacklisted. The realistic scenario involved disappearing quietly, another casualty of speaking when silence was expected. If she was right, but Tony didn't believe her fast enough, James would neutralize both of them before any verification could happen. A maid making accusations would seem like exactly the kind of distraction conspirators might use, and James's first instinct would be eliminating the threat. Lisa would die, Tony would die moments later, and the only thing her courage would achieve was dying slightly ahead of schedule. Even if she was right and Tony believed her and acted immediately, Lisa would have made herself visible to the most dangerous people in the room. She'd be a witness to conspiracy, someone who'd observed what trained security had missed, a liability that would need managing. Tony might protect her initially, but witnesses to high-level betrayals rarely enjoyed long, peaceful lives. Someone, somewhere down the line, would decide she knew too much and arrange a convenient accident. Every calculation pointed toward the same conclusion. Intervention meant death, either immediate or delayed, either from Tony's wrath or James's cleanup, or the rival organization's paranoia about loose ends. The smart choice was obvious. Walk away, finish her shift, collect her tips, and go home. If Tony died tonight, she'd read about it in tomorrow's news, another gangland killing in a city full of them. She'd never be connected to it, never be questioned about it, never suffer consequences for failing to prevent something that wasn't her responsibility. She was a maid. Her job was serving champagne, not preventing assassinations. Nobody expected her to be a hero. Nobody would blame her for not risking her life to save a criminal who'd never acknowledged her existence beyond accepting the drinks she poured. But Lisa's hands stilled on the fresh linens, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory with the particular clarity that came from moral teaching delivered with love and absolute conviction. Baby girl, there's a difference between surviving and living. Surviving means you do what you have to do to see another day. Living means you do what you have to do to look yourself in the mirror. Both matter, but if you spend your whole life just surviving, you wake up one day and realize you're alive, but you're not really living, you're just breathing and waiting to stop. Lisa had spent 5 years surviving, keeping her head down, staying invisible, accepting degradation and dismissal, because the alternative was unemployment and poverty. She'd swallowed her pride, ignored her intelligence, performed the role of simple, forgettable servant, because that's what paid the bills and kept her mother's medical care funded. But she'd also been watching, learning, developing skills that went far beyond what any server needed. She'd cultivated her observational abilities not just for survival, but because some part of her refused to be truly invisible, insisted on seeing even when she couldn't be seen, maintained her intelligence and awareness, even while pretending to be decoration. And now those skills had given her information that could save a life. Not a good life. Tony Olson was undoubtedly responsible for suffering and death across the city. But a life nonetheless, one that was about to be taken through calculated betrayal rather than fair conflict. More pragmatically, Lisa's survival instincts were screaming that the conspiracy wouldn't stop with Tony's death. The men positioned at the exits, the coordinated timing, the sophisticated planning, all of it suggested a group that would eliminate witnesses as standard protocol. Staff would be questioned, potentially silenced, definitely viewed as security risks. Lisa had seen the pattern. That made her dangerous whether she intervened or not. Her choice wasn't between safety and risk. It was between dying quietly while a murder happened or dying loudly while trying to prevent it, and maybe, just maybe, surviving if her warning reached Tony in time and his infamous paranoia actually protected her instead of killing her. Lisa pulled the small notepad from her apron pocket, the one staff used for taking complex orders, and grabbed a pen with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Her decision was made, not because it was smart, but because it was right, and because 5 years of forced invisibility had finally shown her something worth being seen for. She would write the warning, she would deliver it, and whatever happened next would at least happen because she'd chosen action over complicity, chosen visibility over silence, chosen to live instead of just survive. Her pen touched paper, and Lisa began writing the words that would either save 2 lives or end hers in the next 3 minutes. Lisa's hand moved across the small notepad page with controlled urgency, her years of service work providing the muscle memory to write clearly despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The message needed to be explicit, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as vague warning or paranoid speculation. Tony Olson wouldn't act on subtle hints. He'd need direct accusation backed by specific threat. She wrote in block capitals, making each letter distinct and readable. Your right-hand man sold you out. You are the payment. The words stared back at her, raw and unambiguous, the kind of accusation that would either save a life or end hers in the next 60 seconds. Lisa folded the paper once, then again, creating a small square that could be palmed easily, transferred discreetly, delivered without drawing attention from the man she was accusing. Her training in invisibility, cultivated over 5 years of moving through elite spaces without being noticed, would need to execute its most important performance. She needed to approach Tony's table, get close enough to deliver the note, and complete the transfer before James registered her as a threat rather than routine service staff. The challenge was timing. James maintained constant awareness of approaches to Tony, his eyes scanning the room with systematic precision. Lisa had observed his pattern during previous galas. He tracked movement toward Tony's position with heightened focus, evaluated threats based on profile and trajectory, and positioned himself to intercept anything concerning before it reached his boss. Under normal circumstances, James would let a maid through without suspicion. Staff approached constantly to refill drinks, clear plates, provide routine service. But Lisa's observational skills, the very talent that had identified the conspiracy, also made her movements potentially suspicious to someone trained to detect anomalies. If she approached too directly, too purposefully, James might read her intention and neutralize her before she reached Tony. Lisa needed camouflage. A legitimate reason to be at Tony's table that would seem routine enough to bypass James's threat assessment while getting her close enough to deliver the note. She scanned the table from across the room, her eyes cataloging what was needed. Tony's bourbon glass was 3/4 full, no immediate need for refill. His dinner plate had been cleared 20 minutes ago, no obvious service requirement that would justify approach. Then Lisa noticed the napkin on the floor near Tony's chair, probably dropped accidentally during an earlier course. Perfect. Retrieving a fallen napkin was exactly the kind of minor forgettable task that defined servant work, necessary enough to justify approach, menial enough to seem beneath notice. Lisa grabbed a fresh napkin from the service station and moved toward Tony's corner table, her posture and pace calibrated to communicate routine service rather than urgent mission. She kept her eyes slightly downcast, her expression neutral, her body language broadcasting invisible servant performing mundane duty to anyone watching. As she crossed the ballroom, time seemed to distort. Each step took forever, and no time at all. Her awareness expanded to encompass every detail, the string quartet playing Vivaldi, the laughter from a nearby group, the clink of glasses, the murmur of dangerous conversations disguised as social pleasantries. And threading through it all, her consciousness of James Kinlaw's position behind Tony's shoulder, his eyes that might be tracking her approach right now, his hand that could move toward his weapon if he sensed threat. Lisa reached the perimeter of Tony's table. James's gaze flickered toward her, assessed, and moved on. Just another maid, just routine service, nothing requiring his intervention. The dismissal should have felt insulting. Instead, it was salvation. "Excuse me, Mr. Olson," Lisa said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard without drawing attention from other tables. "Your napkin." She bent down, retrieving the dropped napkin with one hand, while her other hand, the one holding the folded note, moved with practiced precision toward Tony's armrest. Years of serving champagne on crowded trays, of navigating tight spaces without spilling, of performing delicate tasks while maintaining balance, all of it culminated in this single moment of dexterity. Her fingers placed the folded note on the armrest directly beside Tony's right hand, the paper landing softly enough to seem like accidental contact, deliberately enough to ensure he'd notice it. Then she straightened, holding the retrieved napkin, and stepped back with the practiced efficiency of someone completing a minor task. "Thank you," Tony said absently, his attention still on the conversation he'd been having with an associate at the table. Lisa turned to leave, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She'd done it. The note was delivered. Tony would find it, read it, and either believe her warning or dismiss it as insane accusation. She'd walked perhaps 3 steps when she heard Tony's voice again, sharper this time, carrying an edge that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "Wait!" Lisa froze, every muscle locked, her mind racing through possibilities. He'd found the note already. He was reading it now, and in approximately 5 seconds, Tony Olson would either save her life by believing her, or end it by thinking she was part of the conspiracy. Behind her, she heard the subtle shift of fabric that meant James had moved, his attention now fully focused on whatever had caught Tony's interest. The predator was alert, his threat assessment system activated by his boss's tone. Lisa turned slowly, her face composed into neutral professionalism despite the terror flooding her system. Tony was looking at the note, his expression unreadable, his body language controlled in the way of men who'd learned to never broadcast emotion in public. Then his eyes lifted from the paper and locked onto Lisa's face with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. He was reading her, assessing her, searching for deception or confirmation, trying to determine if this was elaborate attack or genuine warning. Lisa held his gaze, letting him see the fear in her eyes, the desperate sincerity, the absolute conviction that had driven her to risk everything. She didn't have words to defend herself, didn't have evidence beyond what she'd observed, didn't have anything except the truth written on a folded piece of paper and the expression on her face. Tony's eyes narrowed fractionally. His hand moved, almost casually, to his inside jacket pocket, and in that moment, Lisa knew her life was balanced on the razor edge of Tony Olson's paranoid genius, his ability to distinguish between genuine threat and false alarm, between loyal warning and conspiracy's distraction. "James," Tony said quietly, his eyes never leaving Lisa's face. "Step forward." Behind her, Lisa heard James move, his footsteps bringing him within arm's reach. The room seemed to hold its breath, and Lisa Brantley, invisible maid and expert observer, waited to discover if she'd just saved a life or sealed her own fate. Lisa stood motionless as James moved past her, positioning himself directly in Tony's eyeline. The trusted lieutenant's expression showed confusion rather than alarm. He didn't yet understand why his boss had called him forward. Didn't recognize that the next 30 seconds would determine whether his 12-year performance ended in triumph or catastrophe. "Sir?" James asked, his voice carrying the exact tone of professional concern that had served him perfectly for over a decade. No defensiveness, no fear, just the alert readiness of someone prepared to address whatever issue had caught his boss's attention. Tony's eyes remained locked on Lisa for another long moment, his mind processing variables at computational speed. She could see the calculation happening behind his gaze, weighing her demeanor against the accusation, measuring her terror against the possibility of deception, running threat assessments that had kept him alive through 30 years of betrayals and power struggles. Then he looked down at the note again. Reading the block capital letters one more time, "Your right-hand man sold you out. You are the payment." "James," Tony said, his voice carrying the particular flatness that preceded violence. "How long have we worked together?" 12 years, sir." James's answer was immediate, precise, the kind of response that demonstrated his constant awareness of their shared history. 12 years, Tony repeated, his tone almost conversational. 12 years of absolute loyalty. You've saved my life 4 times. You've never questioned an order. You've turned down offers from rivals that would have made you rich. You're the one person in my organization I trust without reservation." James nodded slightly, though something in his posture had shifted, a barely perceptible tension that suggested his tactical mind was beginning to recognize danger, even if he couldn't yet identify its source. "Which is exactly," Tony continued, his hand moving with casual precision to the weapon inside his jacket. Why you were worth so much to whoever bought you. The words hung in the air for a fractional second, the accusation so unexpected that even James's trained reflexes needed a moment to process it. And in that moment, Tony moved. His weapon cleared his jacket with practiced speed, the barrel aimed directly at James's center mass before the lieutenant's hand had fully reached his own concealed firearm. Around them, the ambient conversation continued, other guests oblivious to the drama unfolding in the corner, the string quartet still playing, the gala's dangerous elegance proceeding without interruption. Don't, Tony said quietly. Your hand moves another inch toward that weapon, and you're dead before you clear the holster. James froze, his expression transforming from confusion to calculation. He was assessing options, running scenarios, searching for the tactical opening that would let him salvage the situation. But with Tony's weapon already drawn and at least 3 of Tony's security personnel now moving toward the table in response to their boss's body language, those options had narrowed to nothing. I don't know what you've been told, James said carefully, his voice steady despite the gun aimed at his chest. But someone is lying to you. 12 years, Tony. 12 years of loyalty. Would I throw that away? For the right price? Tony's smile was cold, predatory. Absolutely, because whoever bought you didn't just offer money. They offered something better. They offered me. My territory, my operations, my position. That's what you are delivering tonight, isn't it? That's what makes you valuable enough to be worth the investment. Lisa watched the micro-expressions flicker across James's face, the fractional tightening around his eyes that confirmed guilt, the slight adjustment in his stance that prepared for violence. The calculation that recognized his performance had just been exposed after 12 years of perfect execution. The maid? James asked, his gaze shifting to Lisa for the first time, reassessing her from invisible servant to threat he'd somehow missed. You're believing a maid? I'm believing what I see in your face right now, Tony said. You didn't deny it fast enough. You calculated first, which means you were running scenarios about how to salvage this instead of being genuinely confused by an insane accusation. That's the tell, James. After 12 years, I know how you think. And right now, you're thinking like someone who just got caught. Tony's free hand made a subtle gesture, and 2 of his security personnel moved behind James, their hands on his shoulders, preventing any sudden movement. A third man patted James down efficiently, removing 2 weapons, one from the shoulder holster Tony knew about, and a second from an ankle rig that Tony clearly hadn't known about. 2 guns, Tony observed. You never carry 2 guns to these galas. We agreed it was excessive, violated the spirit of neutral ground, but tonight you brought backup firepower. Why would tonight be different, James? Unless tonight was special? James's expression hardened, the facade of loyalty finally cracking to reveal the calculation beneath. You can't prove anything. I'm armed because I'm security. I'm always armed. But you're not always signaling to contacts positioned at strategic exits, Lisa heard herself say, her voice steadier than she'd expected. All eyes turned to her, Tony's with renewed interest, James's with lethal focus. 47 minutes ago, you adjusted your left cuff with your right hand. Unnatural movement, created a visible moment with your watch face. 3 seconds later, the man by the terrace entrance made eye contact with you. Confirmation signal. There are 4 more positioned around the room. Different exits. Same unremarkable profile. She pointed without looking, her observational memory providing exact locations. Terrace entrance near the bar, by the main exit, and one near the conservatory door. Tony's eyes narrowed, his tactical mind processing the information. He made another subtle gesture, and his security personnel began moving toward the locations Lisa had indicated. Their movements casual enough not to trigger immediate alarm, but purposeful enough to intercept threats. She's wrong, James said, but his voice carried the hollowness of someone whose lie had already been exposed. She's seeing patterns that don't exist. Paranoid observation from someone who saved my life, Tony interrupted, by seeing what you thought was invisible. By being smarter than my entire security operation. By having the courage to risk everything to warn me about the person I trusted most. He looked at Lisa directly, his expression carrying something that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of proprietary interest, the look of someone recognizing valuable asset. What's your name? Lisa Brantley, sir. Well, Lisa Brantley. Tony's weapon never wavered from James's center mass. You just earned yourself a debt I can't possibly repay, but I'm going to try. The confrontation lasted another 15 seconds before James made his final calculation and went for broke. His hand snapped toward the concealed knife Tony's security had missed during the pat-down, a ceramic blade sewn into his belt lining, invisible to metal detectors and cursory searches. The movement was professional, explosive, aimed at creating enough chaos to reach the terrace exit where his conspirators waited. He never completed the motion. Tony's first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second hit center mass before James's body finished the rotation. The suppressed weapon produced sounds like champagne corks popping, loud enough to be noticed by nearby tables, but muffled enough not to create immediate panic. James went down hard, blood spreading across his expensive suit, his breathing ragged, but not yet terminal. Tony kept the weapon trained on him while his security personnel swarmed the position, their bodies creating a wall between the fallen lieutenant and the rest of the gala. The room's ambient noise faltered, conversations dying as guests processed what they'd witnessed. But this was a gathering of people intimately familiar with violence. Shock registered on faces for perhaps 5 seconds before professional instincts reasserted control. Witnesses looked away deliberately. Conversations resumed with forced normality. The string quartet, showing remarkable composure, continued playing without missing a note. This was neutral ground, but neutrality didn't mean safety. Everyone understood that what they'd just seen was internal business, and internal business required amnesia from observers who valued their continued existence. Tony made a gesture, and 4 of his personnel moved toward the locations Lisa had identified. The confrontation was swift and efficient. 3 men at various exits found themselves surrounded by armed security before they fully registered the threat. The 4th, the man near the terrace, was smarter or faster. He disappeared into the crowd, making for the exit with enough of a head start that pursuit would cause the kind of scene everyone wanted to avoid. Let him go, Tony said quietly. He'll report back to whoever's paying for this. Let them know their investment didn't return profit. He looked down at James, who was gasping on the floor, his eyes carrying the particular frustration of someone who'd played a long game perfectly and lost in the final moment. 12 years, Tony said, his voice carrying genuine disappointment beneath the fury. 12 years of my trust, and you threw it away for what? Money? Territory? The chance to run your own operation? James coughed, blood flecking his lips. You would have done the same, he managed. Same position, same offer, same opportunity. Maybe, Tony admitted. But I would have had the decency to kill you first instead of pretending loyalty while selling me to the highest bidder. That's the difference between ambition and betrayal. Ambition I can respect. Betrayal? He shook his head. That's just bad business. He nodded to his security. Get him medical attention. I want him alive for questioning. He's going to tell us everything about who bought him, what they paid, and what else they know about our operations. 2 men lifted James carefully, carrying him toward a side exit where vehicles were already being positioned. The remaining security personnel formed a perimeter, their presence discouraging curiosity from other guests who'd witnessed the incident. Tony turned his attention back to Lisa, who'd remained frozen throughout the confrontation. Her mind processing the violence she'd just witnessed, the life she'd just saved, the consequences that would now cascade from this moment. You're bleeding, Tony observed. Lisa looked down, surprised to see a thin line of blood on her forearm. Apparently, James's knife had come closer to her than she'd realized during the struggle. The cut was superficial, but Tony was already gesturing to someone who produced a first aid kit with the efficiency of an organization accustomed to treating wounds. "Sir," one of Tony's security approached quietly. "The three we detained. What do you want done with them?" "Hold them in the vehicles. I'll question them after we resolve the immediate situation." Tony's eyes never left Lisa. "And make sure Miss Brantley gets proper medical attention. Then arrange secure transport." "She's coming with us." Lisa's stomach dropped. "Sir, You just exposed a conspiracy that would have killed me and destabilized my entire organization," Tony interrupted. "That makes you either the bravest person I've met or the most foolish. Either way, you're now a witness to attempted assassination, and witnesses to my business don't get to just walk away and resume normal lives. So we can do this the easy way, where you accept my protection and we figure out what happens next together. Or we can do this the hard way, where I ensure your silence through methods you won't enjoy. Your choice." The words were delivered without particular threat, just a statement of reality in Tony Olson's world. Lisa had stepped into visibility, had involved herself in his business, had demonstrated capabilities that made her valuable or dangerous, depending on perspective. There was no returning to invisibility now. "The easy way," Lisa said quietly, recognizing that this was less choice than illusion of choice, but also understanding that Tony's protection was the only thing standing between her and the rival organization that had just lost a substantial investment. "Smart," Tony said approvingly. He looked at the security personnel. "Miss Brantley is under my personal protection, effective immediately. Anyone who threatens her answers to me directly. Make sure that information spreads to everyone who needs to know it." Around them, the gala was already returning to its dangerous equilibrium. The incident had been contained, the threat neutralized, the witnesses properly motivated to develop amnesia. By tomorrow, the official story would be internal dispute resolved quietly, nothing that required external investigation or interference. But Lisa knew the truth would spread through different channels. The story of the maid who'd seen what trained security had missed, who'd risked execution to warn a mafia boss about his trusted lieutenant's betrayal, who'd been elevated from invisible servant to protected asset in a single night. Tony held out his hand, a gesture that was simultaneously offer and command. "Come on, Miss Brantley. We have a lot to discuss about your very sudden career change." Lisa took his hand, feeling the weight of transformation settle over her like a cloak. She'd entered the Rosewood estate as invisible staff, disposable and forgettable. She was leaving as something entirely different: witness, asset, and unwilling participant in Tony Olson's world, where loyalty was currency and her observational talents had just become the most valuable thing about her. The golden cage had opened, but she'd just traded it for a different kind of prison, one with better accommodations and infinitely more dangerous consequences for any attempt at escape. Tony's vehicles were waiting in the private garage beneath the Rosewood estate, a fleet of armored SUVs positioned for rapid departure. Lisa found herself guided into the middle vehicle, flanked by security personnel whose professional courtesy couldn't quite mask their curiosity about the maid, who'd just upended their boss's inner circle. Tony sat across from her in the spacious rear compartment, his weapon now holstered but his attention fully focused on Lisa with an intensity that made her understand why people feared him. This wasn't the social version of Tony Olson she'd observed at galas. This was the strategist who'd built an empire through reading people, identifying threats, and exploiting advantages before his enemies recognized they'd revealed vulnerabilities. "Tell me everything," Tony said, as the vehicle pulled out of the garage, the convoy moving through the city with the kind of escort that discouraged police interference. "From the beginning, what made you notice James?" Lisa took a breath, organizing her thoughts, recognizing that this interrogation would determine her value and therefore her survival in Tony's world. She couldn't afford to seem confused or uncertain. Her observations needed to be precise, her reasoning sound, her intelligence undeniable. "I've worked 5 galas at the Rosewood estate," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've seen you and James at 4 of them. I started noticing patterns, how he moves, where he positions himself, how he scans rooms. It became a reference baseline. You study my security?" Tony's tone was neutral, but the question carried weight. "I study everyone," Lisa said honestly. "It's survival. I'm black, female, and working in spaces full of powerful people who barely register my existence. Understanding who's dangerous, who's desperate, who's about to cause problems. That's the difference between making it through a shift unharmed or becoming collateral damage when violence erupts." Tony nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he understood that calculation more than she'd expected. "Continue." Tonight, James deviated from his pattern. At 9:47, he adjusted his left cuff with his right hand, crossing his body in a way that violated his usual economy of motion. The gesture looked natural but served no functional purpose. It was performance, not necessity. And it created a visible moment with his watch face that caught light across the room. Lisa closed her eyes, replaying the memory with the precision that had always characterized her observations. 3 seconds after the cuff adjustment, the man positioned near the terrace entrance made direct eye contact with James, sustained for exactly 3 seconds, no other interaction, no gesture, just that locked gaze. Then both returned to neutral as if nothing had happened. "You're certain about the timing?" one of the security personnel asked from the front seat. "I'm certain about everything I observed," Lisa said, opening her eyes. "That's my skill. I see patterns, deviations, the tells that people don't know they're broadcasting. It's not photographic memory exactly. It's more like my brain catalogs behavioral data automatically and flags anomalies." Tony leaned forward slightly. "Describe the man at the terrace entrance." "Mid-40s, 5'10", maybe 170 pounds. Brown hair, forgettable features, the kind of face that doesn't stick in memory, which made me pay more attention because that level of unremarkability is usually deliberate. Charcoal suit, no tie, good quality but not designer. Holding a martini he never actually drank from. Positioned where he had clear sightline to your table and direct access to the terrace exit." "That's extremely detailed observation for someone serving champagne across the room," Tony said, though his tone carried appreciation rather than skepticism. "That's why you're alive," Lisa replied, "because I see details other people miss. Because 5 years of forced invisibility taught me that survival means understanding environments better than the people who think they own them." Tony sat back, his mind clearly processing implications. "The other 3 positions you identified. Give me the same level of detail." Lisa spent the next 10 minutes describing each conspirator, their positioning, appearance, behavioral patterns, the subtle coordination that suggested they were operating as a unit. She explained how she'd recognized the setup as assassination rather than security, how the tactical positioning eliminated Tony's escape routes while appearing coincidental, how the timing of James's signal indicated imminent execution rather than future planning. "If I hadn't intervened," Lisa concluded, "James would have moved within the next 60 to 90 seconds. Probably waited until you lifted your bourbon glass. Fractional distraction, reduced peripheral awareness. He'd have drawn and fired before your other security could respond, and the positioned conspirators would have created enough chaos to cover his extraction." "Except you warned me instead," Tony said quietly, "knowing I might kill you for the accusation, knowing James would definitely kill you if I didn't believe you fast enough. You risked certain death to save someone you don't know, someone whose business you should want nothing to do with. Why?" Lisa met his gaze directly. "Because watching someone die when I could prevent it would have cost me more than my life. It would have cost me my ability to live with myself. And because—" She hesitated, then decided honesty was her only viable strategy. Because I recognized that if the conspiracy succeeded, witnesses would be eliminated. I was already a target by virtue of being observant. Warning you was the only chance both of us had. Tony smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face from dangerous to almost warm. Smart and honest, rare combination. He looked at his security chief. Marcus, new protocols effective immediately. Miss Brantley's observational assessments carry the same weight as verified intelligence. If she flags something, we treat it as credible threat until proven otherwise. He turned back to Lisa. Your mother's medical bills. How much? The question caught Lisa off guard. Sir? Your mother's medical bills, Tony repeated patiently. The debt that's forcing you to work 5 galas serving people who treat you like furniture. How much does she owe? 83,000, Lisa said quietly. Cancer treatment, experimental therapy that insurance wouldn't cover. It's paid. By tomorrow morning, the balance will be 0, and her care will continue under comprehensive coverage that I'm arranging. Tony's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiation. Your apartment rent, also covered. Any other immediate financial pressures that might distract you from your new responsibilities, handle them. New responsibilities? Lisa asked, though she already suspected what was coming. You just demonstrated a skill set my organization desperately needs and didn't know existed, Tony said. The ability to read people, spot deception, identify threats that trained security misses. That's not Maid work, Miss Brantley. That's intelligence analysis. And you're going to teach my people how you do it while doing it yourself in situations where your particular talents provide advantage. He leaned forward again, his expression serious. I'm offering you a position. Real salary, real authority, real protection. You'll be part of my legitimate business operations. I own a security consulting firm that works with corporate clients. Your official title will be something boring like behavioral analyst. Your actual job will be keeping me and my interests safe by seeing what other people miss. And if I say no, Lisa asked, needing to understand her actual options. Then I ensure your safety through other means, set you up financially so you never need to work another gala, and we part ways with my gratitude and a very serious non-disclosure agreement. Tony's voice carried absolute sincerity. I don't force loyalty, Lisa. I buy it, earn it, or respect its absence. You saved my life. That means you get choices, not commands. Lisa looked at him, at the security personnel, at the vehicle carrying her away from the only life she'd known towards something completely unknown. She'd spent 5 years being invisible, believing safety meant silence. Tonight she'd learned that her greatest strength was seeing what others missed, and Tony Olson was offering her a life where that strength was valued instead of wasted. I accept, she said. With one condition. Tony raised an eyebrow. Bold. What's the condition? I report to you directly. No intermediaries, no chain of command that could be compromised. If I see something, I tell you personally. No filters. Tony smiled again, this time with genuine respect. Deal. Welcome to the organization, Miss Brantley. Something tells me you're going to change how we do business. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Lisa Brantley sat in a corner office overlooking the city's financial district, reviewing security footage with the kind of focused attention that had once been wasted on serving champagne to people who never learned her name. The office was hers, modest by executive standards, but luxurious compared to the staff quarters she'd occupied at various estates. Real furniture, professional equipment, a door that locked from the inside, and most importantly, a title that commanded respect rather than dismissal. Behavioral Analysis. Director for Olson Security Consulting, a legitimate firm that provided threat assessment and corporate security services to Fortune 500 companies. The legitimate part was technically accurate. The firm did exactly what its marketing materials claimed, but it also served as cover for Tony's intelligence operations, providing a framework where Lisa's observations could be applied to both legal and less legal enterprises without drawing scrutiny from law enforcement. Her mother's medical bills had disappeared within 24 hours, just as Tony had promised. The experimental treatment continued under comprehensive coverage that included home care assistance and transportation services. Her mother had cried when Lisa explained the debt was gone, though Lisa had been deliberately vague about how that miracle had occurred. The apartment rent had been paid 6 months in advance, then replaced entirely when Tony's people relocated Lisa to a secure building with actual amenities and surveillance systems that made her previous neighborhood security look like decorative suggestions. The move had been presented as necessary protection, but Lisa recognized it also as statement. She was valuable enough to protect, important enough to monitor, connected enough to require the kind of housing that kept her visible to Tony's organization. Her new salary was triple what she'd earned working galas. And that didn't include the bonuses Tony distributed when her observations prevented problems or identified opportunities. Financial security she'd never imagined was now her baseline, with growth potential that depended entirely on how valuable she proved to the organization. But money wasn't the transformation that mattered most. For the first time in her adult life, Lisa was visible. Not as decoration or servant, not as anonymous labor making wealthy people's lives function smoothly, but as herself, as someone whose intelligence was recognized, whose observations were valued, whose presence changed how rooms operated rather than being ignored by them. She'd spent the first month training Tony's security personnel, teaching them her observational techniques. Most couldn't replicate her instinctive pattern recognition, but they learned to be more systematic in their awareness, to catalog baseline behaviors and flag deviations, to understand that threats often announce themselves through subtle anomalies rather than obvious actions. Tony had attended several of these training sessions personally, his questions revealing how seriously he took the near miss that had almost cost him everything. He'd restructured his entire security operation around the lessons learned from James's betrayal, implementing redundancies and cross-checks that made insider conspiracy significantly harder to execute. James himself had provided extensive information during interrogation, his cooperation purchased through the promise of medical treatment and eventual release rather than the alternative. The conspiracy had been even larger than initially suspected. A rival organization had spent 3 years and millions of dollars turning James, establishing the infrastructure to leverage his position into total access. That organization had been systematically dismantled over the past 3 months through Tony's methodical retaliation. Assets seized, leadership eliminated or absorbed, territory redistributed. The message was clear. Betraying Tony Olson's trust cost more than just the conspirators. It cost everyone connected to them. Lisa tried not to think too carefully about her role in that violence. She'd saved Tony's life, yes, but she'd also triggered consequences that rippled through the criminal underworld with lethal force. People had died because she'd written a note and delivered a warning. That knowledge sat uneasily in her conscience, even as she recognized she'd make the same choice again. Marcus knocked on her office door, entering with the respectful courtesy that still surprised her after years of being treated as invisible. Morning briefing in 10 minutes. Tony wants your assessment on the Chicago situation. I'll be ready, Lisa said, closing the security footage she'd been reviewing. She stood, adjusting her professional attire, tailored suit that cost more than a month's salary from her previous life, accessories that communicated authority rather than servitude. Her reflection in the office window showed someone transformed not just externally, but fundamentally. The invisible maid had become the expert analyst, the overlooked observer had become the trusted advisor. But beneath the transformation, Lisa recognized she was still performing a role, still navigating spaces where danger was constant and visibility meant different risks than invisibility had carried. She'd traded one cage for another, larger, more comfortable, but still fundamentally a cage where leaving meant consequences she couldn't fully control. Tony had been generous, protective, respectful of her boundaries in ways that surprised her. But she also understood that his generosity came with expectations, that her debt to him for saving her mother and elevating her life created obligations that transcended normal employment. She was valuable, yes, but valuable things were owned, protected, and controlled by people who understood their worth. The morning briefing covered expansion into new territory, potential threats from rival organizations, analysis of behavioral patterns in corporate clients who might be hiding financial crimes that could expose them to leverage. Lisa provided assessments, flagged concerns, offered observations that changed how Tony's people approached problems. Afterward, Tony asked her to stay behind, his expression carrying the warmth she'd learned to recognize as genuine rather than performance. "How are you adjusting?" he asked. "Better than expected," Lisa said honestly, "though I'm still processing how much my life changed in a single night." "Mine too," Tony said. "James's betrayal taught me that even absolute trust has blind spots. Your observation taught me that the people I dismiss as invisible often see the most. That's why I'm expanding your role. I want you working directly with my inner circle, teaching them to think the way you do, to see what they're missing." He paused, his expression serious. "But I also want you to understand something. You saved my life, Lisa. Not because you wanted reward or recognition, but because it was right. That kind of integrity is rare in my world. Rare enough that I want to protect it, even though protecting it means surrounding you with circumstances that might compromise it." "I've thought about that," Lisa admitted. "About whether working for you means becoming complicit in things I shouldn't accept. And? And I decided that perfect moral purity is a luxury I couldn't afford when I was serving champagne, and I can't afford it now either. But I can choose to use my position to prevent unnecessary harm, to push for better choices when options exist, to be a voice for restraint when your world tends toward violence." Tony nodded slowly. "That's all I ask. Be honest with me, even when it's uncomfortable. See what I'm missing, even about myself. That's worth more than any intelligence report." Lisa left the briefing room and returned to her office, to the life she'd never imagined, to the visibility that was both liberation and burden. She'd stepped out of the shadows and discovered that light cast its own complications. But she was seen now, truly seen, and after 5 years of invisibility, that made every complication worthwhile. Her grandmother had told her once that strength came not from hiding, but from knowing when hiding served you, and when visibility served truth. Lisa had spent her life mastering invisibility. Now she was learning to wield visibility with the same precision. And in Tony Olson's dangerous world, that precision might be the thing that kept both of them alive. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.